Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to Talking Tudors, episode 24. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the wonderful patrons who very generously pledged to support this podcast. A huge thank you to Andy, Joanna and Christina, Sharon, Jenny, Julie, Noelle, Zon, Raluca, Dawn and Daniel. A big thank you to Leslie, Katie, Jenny G, Sarah, Shah, Beth, Carol, and thank you also to Caroline, Sally, Haynes, Fiona, Stephanie, Stacey, Callan, and Marcus. If you love Talking Tudors and would like to show your appreciation and support the work I do, just click on the Be My Patron on Podbean badge on the homepage of my website www.onthetudortrail.com, or click on the Be a Patron button on the Podbean app. Join the Talking Tudors patron family before the end of March and you'll be automatically entered into our patron-only monthly giveaways. This month's prize is a $50 gift card to coloringtudorhistory.com, home to Colouring History, Tudor Queens and Consorts, a lavishly illustrated colouring book for grown-ups, and a range of fabulous Tudor-inspired gifts, designed and illustrated by the very talented Catherine Holman. Thank you, Catherine, for donating this wonderful gift. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled that joining me on the show to talk about Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots is Professor Kate Williams. Kate is an esteemed author, historian and television presenter, and a professor of history at the University of Reading. She's the author of a number of acclaimed fiction and non-fiction books, including The House of Shadows and Rival Queens, The Betrayal of Mary Queen of Scots. My conversation with Kate straight after this musical break, courtesy of singer-songwriter Karliene. The song Elizabeth's Lullaby is from the Ballad of Anne Boleyn, Karliene's best-selling album inspired by the life of Henry VIII's second queen consort. And Tudors, Kate, how are you?
I'm thrilled to be here. It's fantastic to talk to you.
Oh, it's an absolute honour to have you on the show. I was wondering if you might just introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, I'm Kate Williams. I'm a professor of history here in Reading, and I have written 9 books, and my 9th book is on Mary Queen of Scots, The Betrayal of Mary Queen of Scots, Rival Queens, so about Elizabeth, Mary, and Mary's downfall.
Fabulous. 9 books. That's absolutely incredible. My goodness. What an achievement.
Well, I'm slowly on number 10. I'm slowly writing number 10.
Oh, fantastic. Now, you've mentioned your book that came out last year, which was Rival Queens, The Betrayal of Mary Queen of Scots. What inspired you to write that book?
Well, I'm really fascinated by queenship. I've written quite a lot on queenship, on various queens. It's an area I'm really interested in. And I was really interested in reevaluating Mary in terms of her queenship.
Yes.
Obviously there's been lots about her life, of course. I just interested in her. How was she as a queen? And I think that's a really fascinating question because she's often seen as a failure, as a doomed queen. But if you actually look at what she did when she arrived in Scotland, aged 18, so much of what she did was so similar to the acts of really people who've been deemed really successful queens, most notably Elizabeth I. So she did quite similar acts. The problem was that the situation was so different. The country, the environment, the way in which she was there was so different to the way in which other successful queens, notably Elizabeth I, were there. That simply what she did, what Elizabeth did, that was congratulated, rightly so, as great statesmanship, such as statecraft, rather than such as religious toleration, such as listening to her ministers, such as putting these ministers around her, such as governing to a degree by consensus with both the people and the ministers. Mary does that. Elizabeth does that, and it's congratulated, of course. And Mary does that, and it's just thrown back in her face. I mean, the difference is, I think, that Elizabeth, there are ministers, including her beloved Cecil, who aim to undermine her. They don't think she understands the threat. They don't agree with some of her acts, but they undermine her by ignoring her, by going behind her back. And what they, in Mary's case, they undermine her by attempting to abduct her, to kidnap her. The simple fact was that Elizabeth's rule was, of course, they would have preferred a man, but they wanted Elizabeth. They congratulated her, and Mary, they just didn't. I think they really, when the Earl of Moray, her half brother, illegitimate son of Fifth, came to get her from Scotland, he really hoped that she'd just be a figurehead and he could rule through her. But she wanted to rule, and this Elizabeth's surety, I will rule, certainty, I will rule, I am the one to rule. That's great, and then Mary has the same ambition, and that really signs her death warrant.
So it's interesting.
So it's fascinating that Mary is so similar in terms of her certainty that I should rule, her similar in what she sets out to do in terms of the consensus rule, really, that we do see a lot of. What the difference is that Elizabeth succeeds so greatly and Mary fails and loses everything, and a large part of that is the two different situations. So queenship I think can be that. It really also, as does also all kinds of monarchy, but particularly queenship, I think, depends on the situation in which the queen is in.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you've touched on this already a little bit, but I suppose in popular culture, Mary is often portrayed as this kind of naive, frivolous, impulsive woman, and that's quite unlike the way Elizabeth's portrayed. Mary is often prone to following her heart rather than her head and that type of thing. Does this bear any resemblance to the woman that you came to know during your research, Kate?
No, I don't think it does. I think that that in the case in popular culture it is, but it's fascinating. I think that she's seen as following her heart rather than her due to the marriages. I mean, she was married 3 times. Number 1 was to the Dauphin of France. Number 2 was to Lord Darnley. Number 3 was to the Earl of Bothwell. And Lord Darnley and the Earl of Bothwell are, I think, the worst consorts that we've got in history. And that, I mean, that's saying something, because the bar is high. There are many, many bad consorts in every single way. But Lord Darnley was he was very keen to marry her, very romantic and very seemed the perfect husband, and was obviously a great choice because he was dynastically marvelous. He had a good claim to the English throne. He was royal. He was great on paper, and he was related to her and had sort of a degree of royal blood. If you're not going to marry a foreign prince, which put her into all these complicated questions, then he's a good choice on paper.
Right.
But unfortunately, he simply spent the whole time trying to grab power off her. He wants to be king. I mean, it's interesting. Nearly every female monarch that we've had in this country, in Scotland, in England, have wanted the consort, the husbands wanted to be the king, in a very similar way to we had William and Mary, in which she had the claim. He's the monarch, and we even see it with Albert. He wants to be the king, and Victoria, of course, ignores him and gives him short shrift, and he has no support in that from any of the politicians around her. And really, the Duke of Edinburgh is the first husband of a queen who isn't saying, I want to be king. It's a joint monarchy. I want to be the monarch, and that's amazing, really. And Darnley wants to be the same. He wants to be the king. He wants to be the joint monarch. He undermines Mary initially by plotting against her, and then he involves himself in the Rizzio plot, in which her secretary is seized while they're having a supper with Mary and her friends. He's seized, he's stabbed, and that's all a red herring. It's not about Rizzio and how much they hate him, Darnley and the Lords. It's about how they want to imprison Mary. So they do. She's pregnant. they want to imprison her so that they can use her as a figurehead and have all the power. And so Darnley's this disastrous husband, and then the lords all decide they hate him and want to move against him, and then he's murdered, and then she has Bothwell, and that's where she's often seen as following her heart, because she marries this horrific man. But essentially, it's this is a real misunderstanding of what happens to her. It's sexual assault happens to her, and it's really fascinating because obviously in culture across the world now, we're reevaluating rape, we're reevaluating sexual assault. We're saying no, a woman who is it doesn't mean that she's not raped or sexually assaulted if she doesn't scream, if she doesn't fight back, if she then texts the man the next day, if she tries to speak to him, if she even goes ahead and marries him. This doesn't mean so often in the past it's only been sexual assault and rape. If she screams, if she fights back to the death, when she could endanger her life, and then never speak to rapist again, and he's a stranger, not a friend. And we're really reevaluating this in terms of Me Too, all these big questions that we've got about sexual assault. Yes, so for example, the American Olympic gymnasts, they suffered so much at the hands of the doctor, and of course they didn't scream. What choice had they got? No one would believe them. He'd have them thrown off the team, and he intimidated them and terrified them. And this, so we are reevaluating it, and I think it's obviously, the 16th century. It's not the same period. They wouldn't understand that we're thinking about grooming, but they do understand the question of consent, and they do understand the question of a woman, whether she wants to or not. And it's fascinating because the Earl of Bothwell, Mary, not long after the death of Lord Darnley, she goes to see her son and his nursery in Stirling. She's on the way back, and Bothwell comes up to her and he lays his hand on her bridle. And he has men with her, and she doesn't have that many, but still she thought of him as a friend and and he did try and protect her after the Rizzio plot. So he tells her there's fighting and rioting against her and says, "Come back to my castle." She believes him, and there it's got this fascinating situation because she said he assaulted her, he said he did it, the lords around said he did it, but over time it has become one in which, maybe she didn't, maybe she wanted it. Why did she go with him? Why after he assaulted her did she not scream and run away and jump out of the window? And there are two reasons. In the time, it's a strategy. Men who aren't allowed to marry the woman that they want, they will often try and kidnap her and rape her, because then her father has no choice but to agree, because she's seen by the son of the time as damaged goods. The property's been depredated. If he's going to make it good by marrying her, then all power to him. So it's a strategy to get a woman who denied you, whether it's because you're annoyed at the family or because she's an heiress and you want the money. And so it's a strategy. So Mary, of course, knows about this. And yes, as a queen, she has more power than the average girl, and she could have gone back after it, but she feels ashamed of what's happened. She's a very religious woman, but also she thinks she's pregnant, and baby out of wedlock is to her a sin, and so she thinks she has no choice but to marry Bothwell, and that's how she's been seen as following her heart. But really, in terms of the time, you can see why she did it. She felt she had no choice but to marry him. She was lost. She felt she was pregnant. She was pregnant. It seems that she did get pregnant before the marriage, and so she's in this impossible position. But obviously, Elizabeth does not marry, and that is a brilliant strategy. And she's constantly being pushed by Parliament to marry. They constantly push her, but really, Mary thinks that her husband's going to stop her being constantly sort of attacked and constantly undermined in this physical way, whereas Elizabeth doesn't suffer that. Yes, Parliament are endlessly annoyed with her for not getting married, but they are just not going to kidnap her. So to make her do it. So you see why Mary did it, but I think it's almost impossible it's almost impossible to think of someone who Mary could have married who wouldn't have ended her up in the same violence, the same problems. And yes, Lord Bothwell was a disaster, but she felt she had no choice. And and so I think that she's, when she's being a queen, she thinks very carefully about what she does, and these husbands cause terrible problems for her in every way. And yes, had she not married, then she wouldn't have had them. But I think that obviously she felt she needed to marry, but to protect, to strengthen her position. And it's a getting pregnant as well, because when Mary gets pregnant, it's a marvelous moment. She has a son. It's so marvelous. She strengthens the monarchy. Wonderful. The ambassador rides to tell Elizabeth post haste, and Elizabeth is sad, but couldn't get there fast enough, and is sad. But as soon as Mary has a son, she signed her death warrant, because then he's worth more than her.
Right. Yeah.
But no, he hasn't got any teeth and can't sit up. He's worth more.
Yeah.
But also, then she can be deposed for her son. And I this is one of the reasons why Elizabeth doesn't have children, because immediately Mary has a son, she can be deposed for him, and they can just shift her off the throne and govern for him. And I think even if she had a daughter, this is obviously a what if, but even if she had a daughter, I think they could have thought very carefully about deposing her for her daughter, saying, well, look, you've been a bad queen, we're going to bring this little girl up to be a good queen. But a son, it is a death warrant for her. So she does what she's supposed to. She tries to get married, she has a child, she does what you're supposed to do as a mom. But what Henry VIII tries so hard to do, to find this son, she does it, but it really pulls her down and undermines her, and it is the end of her reign. But as soon as she has that baby.
Gosh, yeah, amazing. I've never really thought of it like that. You've brought up so many wonderful points. Thank you. Now, you mentioned Henry Lord Darnley. Do you think so? I'm sort of sensing that you don't think Mary had something to do with that, or you do think Mary had anything to do with his murder?
The terrible death. Well, it's very interesting, because it's clearly the Earl of Murray, Mary's half brother, behind so much of everything. He gets the Lords to gang up against her. He's the one who wants power, and Darnley really begins to annoy him and the others. He starts to say things like, well, I'll have your land, and he starts to really seem like he's going to take over from them. And he's a really vain, glorious, foolhardy person, and he really annoys all the lords. And they start to say to Mary, you've got to get rid of him. And they call her to a conference at the castle, and they say, look, we want to get rid of him, and Darnley is going to look through we want to get rid of him, and Murray is going to look through his fingers at it. So almost saying he's going to agree with it, he's going to assent with it. And Mary, I'm not, you can't do this, I'm not listening to this. She just says, I'm not listening to this. But that's what they want to do. They essentially, they're at this position now, when she's got this baby son, that they've always wanted to get rid of her, but they realise now they've got to get rid of Darnley as well. If they do ever manage to pop Mary off the throne, they're not going to get the power to be regent. Moray is not going to get that power with Darnley hanging around. So they've got to get rid of both of them. They've got to get rid of him, and they've got to depose her. And so they start making these plots against him. I mean, Mary's encouraged to divorce him, but because they're vaguely related. But of course, that's just not going to work, because everyone's related. Marriage is vaguely related, so that will be the end of everyone's marriage. If hers is illegal, so she can't do that. So what does happen is that then they start to make serious plots against him, and she doesn't want to hear, she doesn't want to listen. But the plots really escalate until you have that fateful night, 10th of February 1567, when there's this massive explosion that rocks Edinburgh, blows up Darnley's house, and he's found with his valet smothered and in the orchard, accompanied by a dagger and a rope, and it's a bit Cluedo, really. It
is very Cluedo.
And a chair and two dressing gowns. Now, what were they doing there? And the reason is because Darnley and his man tried to get out of the window, tried to flee, holding the dagger, were hoping to fight back, but they were caught by the men, and they were smothered, and that was Darnley's death.
Gosh, goodness. All right, so Kate, could you talk to us a little bit about Mary's relationship with Elizabeth I? Obviously, there's lots of stories and misconceptions, and, what did you find during your research?
Well, Mary and Elizabeth initially have a very comparatively sympathetic relationship. They are going to meet in York. There's a lot of conversation about. And Mary really, really wants to meet. She wants to talk to Elizabeth. She wants to be friends with her. Basically, the understanding between two queens. But she also wants Elizabeth to publicly congratulate her, and to a degree, publicly, she wants to be made Elizabeth's heir. She wants to be announced Elizabeth's heir, and because she is the next in line to the throne after Elizabeth. Now, this is a big problem for her, and this is obviously what makes her so dangerous and hated by Cecil and Elizabeth's ministers, because she is the next one along, and could obviously theoretically say, if you really do think that Henry and as Catholic Europe does, that Henry and Anne weren't married, then she's the next legitimate. She's the legitimate one after Edward VI, and so she wants Elizabeth to declare her as her heir, and that's a difficult thing for Elizabeth. She is in a problematic position about this. Should she do it? Shouldn't she? And also, she's got more on her plate than Mary. They talk about meeting up at York, and then Elizabeth has much more to consider than Scotland. So just cancels it, and it's got to be a big thing. I actually made a bit of a mistake in my book, and I picked it up. I said, two queens, you can't just have a little meeting. Two queens can't just meet up to drink tea together. And then I realised, of course, you can't have anyone drinking tea at the time. So I said they can't meet up to do embroidery together. It's got to be a big, it can't be not quite the field of the cloth of gold, but it's got to be big celebration. So Elizabeth's initially very sympathetic, but I think the real rupture of the relationship comes. There's sympathetic letters in between them. The real rupture comes when Mary says to Elizabeth, trying to make this great relationship with them, asking for her advice. She says, "Look, I want your advice. Who should I marry?" And of course, difficult question for Elizabeth. She doesn't want her to marry anyone from Catholic Europe. That would strengthen Mary's hand. That would seem increasingly as if England's surrounded by Catholic Europe on all sides. If Mary was to marry someone from the Spanish royal family, most of the French people. She's already had one. The rest are a bit young, but all the possibilities that she's got. And so Mary is asking Elizabeth, "Who should I marry? Could you help me?" And trying to ask for advice. And then Mary is told. Elizabeth tells her that she wants her to marry Robert Dudley, who she makes Earl of Leicester. And Mary's incredibly insulted by this, because Dudley is a commoner. He's a traitor. He's a traitor's son, not a traitor. He's a traitor's son.
Yes,
so that seems so shocking to Mary. Also, all Europe say he's Elizabeth's lover, and so that seems very insulting. That Mary's going to be a man who either has been Elizabeth's lover or is just so desperately besotted by her. It all seems very insulting. Whatever he is, whether it's just he's in love with Elizabeth and there's nothing has happened, or whether they are truly lovers. It's insulting. And of course the third sort of shadow over Dudley is the fact that there is this suspicion, there's this odd suspicion going round, these rumours going round about how his wife died, about the fact that she was found at the bottom of the stairs dead, and there was suspicion, and it might be that she killed herself because she had this breast cancer. It might be that she fell, and it all might be because that she was pushed. And although it probably wasn't Dudley, I don't think that it was him. It obviously sort of really emphasised the fact that he was never there, because he was always at the side, and that it actually it would be thought to benefit him, because he now was free to marry Elizabeth. So even though I don't think it was him, I think that had he wanted to marry Elizabeth, which I'm sure he did, and had it even been a possibility, which that's another question, whether Elizabeth would ever have agreed to it, there's no way that she would, that with Dudley, having killed his wife, if he did that would ever be possible. So I do that if someone did kill Amy Robsart, that it was one of Dudley's enemies who wanted to get him out of Elizabeth's sort of inner circle forever and ever, because he'd be suspected. And it did have that degree that effect. I mean, certainly Elizabeth could never marry him, even if she had wanted to after that. So there's a three sort of downsides. He's a commoner. He's a traitor's son. It's four downsides. He's a commoner. He's a traitor's son. He's rumoured to be Elizabeth's adoring lover, and there's some rumours saying he killed his wife. So there's no way that Mary is going to marry him. And on top of that, Elizabeth wants Mary and Dudley to live at the English court in this threesome, which would be rather to Mary's detriment. So that's a real break in the relationship. Up until then, it's all very cordial, very friendly, very, oh my goodness, dear Queen. And then Mary's so insulted. She really is insulted that she thinks Elizabeth's not helping her, that she's giving her this English husband. I mean, the Lords were never going to accept him, Mary marrying Dudley. I mean, there's an argument. I sometimes think that, well, maybe he might have been quite an idea as a husband, because if he'd have just basically popped up, married Mary, hopefully get her pregnant, and then go back to England to chat to Elizabeth and go out riding with Elizabeth, well, that would have been quite good, because Mary doesn't have this meddling husband.
That's right.
Maybe that's a possibility, but of course the Lords wouldn't have accepted him because he was English, and Mary did want hope for a husband, not just to produce an heir, but also to protect her, to be there to protect her against these sort of men who were constantly trying to seize her. So it wouldn't have worked, but he was probably going to do better than the others. Better than the others, yeah. I mean, I know that there could have been a possibility that maybe it could have worked, and if it would have pleased Elizabeth for Mary to marry Dudley, then maybe that would have been a price worth paying. If she just said, "Look, I'm not going to come to the English court. I'm just going to sit in my court, and Dudley can pop up on conjugal visits." But obviously, the Lords would have not accepted it, and they didn't. So that's the real break in the relationship, and that's when Mary is so annoyed that she moves to marry Darnley, who is always there saying, "Oh, Cooey, it's me. Hello, Mary. I'm so nice and friendly and kind, and I'll look after you, and I won't try and grab power from you, etc." What a lie. And so, but that really annoys Elizabeth because of his claim to her throne as well. So marrying Darnley is really, Elizabeth is furious and sees it as a threat, quite rightly, really. And so that is really the beginning of the bad relationship between the two of them, and it simply never recovers. Elizabeth is now much more suspicious, and then obviously what happens is the death of Lord Darnley, the murder of Lord Darnley. Mary just is completely lost at what to do. She has no idea what to do. She doesn't know what to do, where to go, and she has a suspicion that it's the Lords around her. She knows they want to get rid of Darnley. If she moves against them, she's moving against all the Lords. She's completely lost. But then they put Bothwell on trial, and it's a show trial. But that to a degree is a show trial. Was what the ordinary people want, and I think there was after that there's an equilibrium. Things calm down, but then Bothwell is released. His show trial, he's found not guilty, and then he assaults her, as we were saying. Then they get married, and that's the beginning of the end. All the Lords hate Bothwell. They aren't going to put up with it. Moray, the Earl of Moray, really, really, really hates him, and so as a consequence, you have this sibling rivalry that we've had throughout Mary's reign ever since she was 18. She's now nearly 25. Really bursts into flames, and there's this final battle, the Battle of Carberry Hill, between Mary and her half brother, the Earl of Moray. Bothwell deserts her. Mary loses, and she's put in prison in Lochleven, and they're forced to abdicate. She miscarries the baby, or indeed it could be twins that carrying by Bothwell. And then Moray turns up and says, "Look, just abdicate for your son. You're hopeless. Just do it. You have no choice." And does. And then she manages to escape in this amazing way. She managed to escape. And then she rides to her stronghold. And then she thinks, "What shall I do?" And by this point, the ordinary people are really hating Moray. They've had enough of him and all the Lords. And no matter how many mistakes Mary's made, and they all hate Bothwell too, they really do support her because they think that, well, she is the real blood, and that's why they didn't ever imprison. They imprisoned her in Edinburgh, but that was a mistake because the ordinary people started clamouring for her being taken out. So they've got to put her miles away, and so they do feel a lot of sympathy for her, and they don't. They do feel a lot of sympathy for her. There's all kinds of murky questions about who committed the murder. They don't necessarily suspect her of that. They think there's a lot of thinking it's the Lords as well, it's the Murray as well. So they start to say they want her back, and so there's an argument. There's a big possibility that she could have got her throne back off Murray. Whether she'd have kept it, that's the question. I don't think she would necessarily have kept it back and forth, but she doesn't stay and fight for it because she thinks the best way to get her back is to go into England and ask Elizabeth to help her.
Yeah, goodness. So she does that. She essentially tries to seek sort of sanctuary in England and spends 20 years as a virtual prisoner. We know, most of us that know this story know that, of course, it doesn't end well for Mary. So after about 2 decades of imprisonment, she's executed at Fotheringhay Castle on the 8th of February, 1587. Kate, could you take us briefly just through the events that, I suppose, the final events that led to the execution of this anointed queen?
Yes, well, she crosses over into England when she's not quite 25 and expects to be helped back onto her throne. And Elizabeth has this problem. Because on one hand, she doesn't like the idea that a queen's been deprived of her throne.
That's right.
It undermines all queenship, in sort of a sense with the terrible words that John Knox has been saying about female monarchs, which really, Elizabeth can't bear him either. And so she's in this difficult position because on one hand, she thinks, yes, Mary should belong back on the throne. On the other hand, Mary is a relation. She's a cousin. She's a Tudor. She wants to help her. On the other hand, the Earl of Moray is this Protestant-friendly government. He is, and has always been, in Cecil's pocket. Cecil's always paid him money, always paid for help to undermine Mary. Now, how much Elizabeth knew about that, I don't know. She has received him, but I don't know how much she necessarily knows about the money being paid over. But Cecil hates Mary. He really hates Mary, and a lot of Parliament feel she's a threat as well. So Elizabeth has this, and also, Elizabeth is a cautious person. She doesn't want to start entering into complicated foreign wars, as many monarchs don't want to do. And why? So this is her question: do I enter into this complicated, drawn-out foreign war that we might lose just to put this woman back on the throne, and she might be pushed off again? So she is in this impossible position. So, but she can't. If Mary is an innocent queen, she needs to live innocently. So, but she can't marry at large in England because Cecil fears she's going to plot against Elizabeth and cause all kinds of problems, be a sort of a lodestone, a touch paper for all the Catholics in England. So they put her under really initially luxurious house arrest, and they say they're going to inquire into her conduct. Did she kill her husband? Right. And then they have inquiry. It can't be a trial. Like Queen can't put on trial. An inquiry. There isn't really. Well, the evidence is so bad because they basically write to the Earl of Moray and say, "Can we have some evidence that she killed Darnley?" And Moray writes back a long letter, this long descriptive letter written by Buchanan saying, "Mary did it." And they say, well, look, this isn't really enough. You can't just send us a letter saying she did it. We need some evidence. So they find these letters in a silver casket under someone's bed in Edinburgh. And they say, look, we've got them. But the letters, they're really a bit hopeless in terms of evidence, really. They're written by Mary, apparently, all saying, I want to get rid of Darnley. Right. But some of them pointless love letters or marriage, that could just be a love letter to God or to anyone. And the actual letters in which which Mary's saying, I want to get rid of him, they don't really work in terms of dates at all. They're completely the wrong dates. If she was writing to Bothwell or someone like that she's not away. So they can't show her these letters because immediately she could undermine them and say they're not right. So they have these letters, an inquiry into Mary's conduct, that she's not allowed to see the evidence and she's not allowed to defend herself. And then it gets all even more disastrous because the head of the inquiry, the Duke of Norfolk, falls in love with Mary and tries to marry her, and that's just, my God. It's just ridiculous. So Elizabeth bungs in the Tower and chops his head off. I mean, the Duke of Norfolk, I like it because it'll be his third marriage. 3 women have died, and he gets ever hopeless and goes to marry Mary. But that's the problem that you're seeing, that people keep saying, they're supposed to be imprisoning her, or they're supposed to be telling her off, or they're supposed to be inquiring into her, and then they think, maybe I'll marry her because she is royal. And this is what you keep seeing with Mary, that people keep trying to, the men are supposed to be imprisoning her or inquiring into her, and they keep trying to marry her. So even when she's in, look, someone is supposed to be in charge of her, and supposed to be really trying to keep her in prison, he tries to marry her too. So the same thing happens, and that just pushes Elizabeth over the edge. The inquiry is, and the inquiry is hopeless. The Duke of Norfolk has her head chopped off, and the outcome of the inquiry it is a sort of a no verdict. It's not that Mary's guilty, because then they'd have to deal with her, maybe execute her, and Catholic Europe would rise up. This is what Elizabeth feels. And she's not innocent, because then she'd have to be set free. So she's found, there's no verdict found. Yuck. So Mary kept under house arrest now for, as you say, for the next 20 years. And you really see a change that happens after the end of the negotiations for marriage with the Duke of Anjou, the French frog.
Yes.
Because then Cecil and they really realise that Elizabeth isn't going to get married. She's not going to have a son, or indeed a daughter. They'll have anything by this point. She's not going to do that. And Mary is the next heir. So things really do get much tougher by this point on Mary. She starts to be kept in a much closer confinement, and eventually the confinement is so close that her jailers boast and say, you can't even, not even a flea could get out.
Right.
But that's a kind of problem, because they start to think, she's always a problem. She's always a problem in court, and Cecil really in the castles, and Cecil really wants to execute her. He really wants to get her because she's a threat. But if she's kept so close that a flea can't get out, then she's never going to give them any cause for that. So they realise that this is a problem. So a double agent is hired who goes to Mary and says, "I'll take your letters for you."
Right.
And he makes friends with her friends in France, and so she believes him. And this double agent says, "I'll take your letters for you." And so Mary does have this messenger man who she thinks she can trust. Of course, she can't. The minute that he gets a letter, he immediately passes it on to the code breaker, who's actually in the same castle. So, yeah. So she and when someone approaches Mary, I mean, she's desperate. She's stayed out of the hands of plots for 20 years, but by this point, she's been in prison for 20 years. She's never going to get out. So when someone does approach her with Anthony Babington with the idea of a plot in which Catholic Europe will invade, in which the Catholics in Britain will rise up, she agrees. And when they get this letter, when the codebreaker gets this letter, he knows he's got the evidence against Mary, and off it goes to London, to Walsingham, to Cecil, and they have what they need to put Mary on trial. Right? I mean, yes, she does commit. The first inquiry trial is wrong. She was not guilty. The second one, well, she is guilty,
right.
And so they put her on trial, and they have the evidence that they need. They don't put her on trial in London because they fear that there'll be support against her. They put her on trial. She's in this essentially this private trial. Just the local aristocracy come and watch, and she defends herself brilliantly. She defends herself fantastically, but essentially she is guilty. She's found guilty, and Elizabeth has this problem when Mary is declared guilty, because she has to be executed. But Elizabeth doesn't want to do it because there's three reasons. She fears that Catholic Europe will rise up and say against her. She is very concerned about executing a fellow woman because she thinks it'll look bad. Mary is her cousin. She's had a lot of bad luck, we could say that. And indeed, that is the Victorians, when Victoria is coming towards the throne, they're seen as no good model of queenship for her, because Elizabeth is not seen as a good model by the early 19th century, because not only did she not secure the throne, but also because she executed a fellow woman. There's no problem with her chopping off the heads of any of the amount of these men. Who cares about the Duke of Norfolk? Who cares about the Earl of Essex? Yes, they deserved it, but a woman, it's seen as unfeminine and not right.
Yeah.
And then the third reason is because Elizabeth is concerned. Mary is an anointed queen. Thus they believe that her authority comes from God, and therefore, as a consequence, if you execute an anointed queen, this might undermine all queenship, and these are big concerns for Elizabeth. So then Mary is declared guilty, and she doesn't want to execute her. She says to other people, "Would you mind just killing her for me?
Yeah.
Would you mind that? Would you mind doing that for me? Would you?" And there has been an act for the Queen's safety that said that she was protected. So theoretically, they could, but they won't do it. They say no. Even Mary's mean keeper, Paulet, who is awful and hates Mary, he says, no, I couldn't do it. No, gosh, no, absolutely. Don't ask me to do that. That's just not. I can't. So Mary, she's this problem, and so Elizabeth has to sign. Eventually, she doesn't want to. Her ministers pushing her to sign this death warrant. In the end, she signs the execution warrant, but she sort of signs it really quickly. Says, "Oh no!" And then she hands it to the clerk, and he whips it away and takes it away to Cecil and the ministers, and they really then they go. Are they going behind her back because they start enacting it without telling her? And does that mean that she thought they'd speak to her about enacting it? She thought they'd talk to her. She thought they'd include her in the conversations. So because they're not including her in the conversations, she thinks it's not being done. I mean, this is the question. Does she think she can? Certainly they enact it really, really fast, because I think they definitely fear that she's going to change her mind. So they really, really enact it super, super fast. And she just isn't told. They go behind her back. She doesn't even know that it's being enacted. And they whip to Fotheringhay, and they tell Mary, after she's had dinner on the 7th, they say, "You're going to be executed tomorrow," in a very rough way. And she says, "But I need time to put my affairs in order." They say, "I'm sorry, you haven't got any time."
Yeah.
So literally, she and her ladies in waiting have this real rush. They're rushing to write the letters, to try and sort out her estates and all her belongings. And she only finishes writing letters at 2 in.the.morning.
Oh,
and then last letter she writes to Henri in the King of France, who has been sympathetic. When Mary has asked Elizabeth before if she could live in quiet exile in France, and he says, "Look, yes, it's fine by me. I'll keep an eye on her. I'll make sure she doesn't plot. I'll just make sure that she lives in retirement and doesn't come against you. I'll do that for you." And Elizabeth says no. So he kind of offers to be Mary's jailer, really, in France, and so he has been sympathetic to Mary. But that's the last letter that she writes at 2 a.m. Then they try and lie down and sleep, and how can she? The lady waits and reads her. How can she sleep? And they can hear downstairs in the hall that the block is being set up. They can hear it being bashed out and set up.
It's just amazing. You really couldn't make this stuff up, could you? It's just incredible.
And then next morning is Mary's execution, and it's obviously even worse. Not only is she being executed really in a rush, but then they're running late. So imagine they're running. And initially she's told she can't take her ladies up with her. She has to go alone. But there is relenting. That's just beyond the pale. And there are aristocrats watching who, although they aren't sympathetic to Mary, think that doesn't show Britain England in the best light to be executing a woman, to have an executioner stripping her. But the ladies in waiting go up with her, and she's praying. The Dean of Peterborough is praying and telling her to repent, and she's praying in her Catholic prayers. And her ladies go up and they help her undress, and she reveals this red bodice and red skirt, the colours of martyrdom, because she wants to be seen as a martyr and as the final Catholic sacrifice. And she is executed. It's a very bungled execution. The execution takes 3 blows to get her head off, and then there's this panic after she's executed. The ports are closed for 6 weeks. Her belongings are gathered, they are grabbed, they are burned. Her servants are shut up so they can't say what's happened. The authorities are just so afraid that there is going to be anger against her, that there is going to be the anger for her, anger against Elizabeth, and Mary's going to be this martyr. And when her heart is taken out and shoved under a mound in Fotheringhay, so that nothing can be a relic. But there's a really nice story that after everything's over and her body is being stripped, they find her dog under her skirt. It's a really sweet story, quivering and afraid, but she wasn't alone on the block. Her little dog went with her and hid under her skirts, and I think that's really so the loyalty of this little dog. That so in the end she wasn't have her little friend with her, but everything else she'd lost. So it's amazing, isn't it? It's amazing, it's amazing, isn't it? Really, Natalie, she had everything, power and status and glory, and and she beauty, all of these things, and great height, 5'11", and then she loses everything, and even loses her head, loses her throne, loses her life, her head.
Yeah, it does sound like it was sort of just an impossible situation for her, that there wasn't really a way, with the way you've explained the context as well. It just seems like it was just impossible choices that she was consistently faced with.
Yes, I don't know how it would have been possible to succeed in the impossible position that she had. And I think one reason for why she had such an impossible position was because she was sent overseas to France as a young girl by her mother. Really, I can see Mary of Guise's position, why she sent Mary over to France age 5, because Henry VIII was trying to seize her for marriage. She could have been constantly kidnapped. She was in danger, and Mary of Guise needed help to fight back against Henry VIII and the English forces, and there was no way the French were going to give her forces for nothing. They wanted to give her forces in exchange for this little girl. But then she's really being treated as a princess, not a queen, as a marriage pawn, being sent over to a foreign court. So not only she's being treated as a princess, not a queen, and married into another foreign royal family. If she'd grown up in Scotland, yes, she would have been in constant danger. But I do think that she would have, that she's created the support around her, because you see what Elizabeth does when she grows up in this very dangerous, difficult exile. She grows the support of Cecil and co around her, and Cecil, will never desert her.
Yeah.
And you have, I think, had Mary grown up in Scotland, she would not only have been there would have been lords that she gained the support of, and simply by the time she gets back at 18, Mary of Guise has been dead over time now, and so the lords have been used to doing what they want and used to doing what they want to do, and they don't want to be told what to do. So I think really that being sent abroad when you're a child, when you are the future monarch, I mean, that's really so very rare. We see Charles II's in exile, but he kind of doesn't have any choice. He's the same way, and obviously, it's a very different situation. So I think that it really, that's the beginning of Mary's problem. So she is in this impossible situation when she gets back to Scotland, because she would have always, I mean, even had she grown up there, the Lords it's a very different environment.
Yes, yeah.
The Lords have always been, there's lots of internecine warfare over who has power, there's lots of battles, there's lots of fights. But I still think that if she'd have grown up there, she would have had advisors around her who listened to her. There's no way that Murray would have been so powerful if she'd always been there and always been seen as the future queen, and always had this surrounding around her and been there with her mother, both of them being seen as fighting back. So I do think that she was in this impossible position as soon as she comes back, and her illegitimate brother, the Earl of Moray, is always trying to undermine, always trying to seize power from her, constantly. I mean, he rises up against her in the very early days. So what could she possibly have done?
Yeah.
And what could she possibly have done? And you see with her son, James VI, the future James I of England and Scotland, I mean, they tried to kidnap him, they tried to abduct him, they tried to do the same to him, but it's harder, because he's obviously male, and he is. It's even clearer to them that he is Elizabeth's heir as well, and Elizabeth is more supportive of him. They have this much more supportive relationship, but they do keep trying to kidnap him as well, and so it's interesting, isn't it, that James is often reviled for his favourites. But I can really see why he had these favourites, because everyone around him was trying to grab him or abduct him or undermine him. So he really had these very close male favourites that he trusted above all else, because everyone else was trying to undermine him. And you see also why he's so obsessed with the divine right of kings, why he's obsessed with, because he sees what happened to his mother, and he sees what throughout his teenage years what they're trying to do to him, that people he thought were friends then turn against him and try and grab him and get power off him. And I mean, this is even after Murray gets shot. He gets shot in the street. So even without him, they're trying to grab James. So, and obviously James is a man. He's a boy. He's a man. He's a male. So they feel less confidence in going against him that they did Mary, because she's just a woman. So it really does. I think Mary's story is so fascinating in terms of what it tells us about queens and queenship. She had an impossible position, and
absolutely.
And I think she did so well in holding on to the throne for those 7 years. I mean, they were trying to get it off her straight away. So, and yes, the only way she could have survived, I think, is by possibly, because is by saying to the Earl of Moray, okay, half brother, you rule with your chums and make all the decisions, and I'll just come out and smile and wave.
Right.
Number one, even then, that's the question, because he had many enemies, many enemies. And number two, she wanted to rule. She felt she should. She felt she should want to rule, and we congratulate Elizabeth for the same. And she wanted to too. She fought against people like John Knox, against the right for a woman to rule, but it was impossible. What was in front of her.
Yeah, what an absolutely intriguing story. It just amazes me. It's incredible. Now, Kate, I wanted to ask you also. So you mentioned, obviously, Mary did plot against Elizabeth towards the end of the imprisonment. Do you think so? For a long time, you don't think she was involved in anything like that? Do you think it was just a matter of she was absolutely exhausted, desperate, frustrated by the end, and so took matters into her own hand?
I don't think she was involved. I mean, she had communications with the court. She had communications with the Spanish court. Right. I think if she'd been involved earlier, they'd have because everything that she did was watched carefully very early on. And I think that there are occasions in which she actually passes on to Elizabeth that she feels that there's plots against both of them. So she does, and she's always trying to be her friends. But although I think there are lots of plots around her, people try and encourage her, she doesn't get involved in them. Now, that's not because she's particularly necessarily. I'm not saying she's particularly perfect. It's because she thinks that Elizabeth will let her free anyway. Right. She thinks that Elizabeth will come round, will let her free. They can have a meeting. She can talk to Cecil. That they'll let her free, and that she'll go and live in France. So she does think this is. So for a long time, she thinks that she's going to get out anyway. I mean, there are reasons. Well, number one, she doesn't want to involve herself with a plot because she knows that this will be the end of her if it's found out. Number two, I mean, I think she honestly doesn't want because she thinks that she's Elizabeth there. She's never said, "Oh, I think I should throw me off and be the queen now." When she's very early on in her father-in-law, they say that she's the Queen of England as well. That's what they say when she's very early on married. Right. But as soon as Mary is independent and gets back to Scotland, she never says I'm the Queen of England or the rightful Queen or anything like that. She just says I want to be your heir. So she doesn't. And then I think the third thing is that she doesn't want to involve herself in a plot is, well, it might not work. Yeah. I mean, Elizabeth is popular. She's very secure on the throne. Well, we see it with the Armada. It doesn't work. They don't. They might fail. It's all very well all the Catholic nobles in the north saying they're going to rise up against too, but these uprisings have failed before. So I think there's these three reasons why she doesn't get involved. Number one, because she thinks it's wrong. Number two, because she hopes to be set free anyway, and because she is innocent of killing her husband and believes that this will be recognised. And number three, maybe it'll fail. So and so it's really at the end when she's very exhausted, treated a very insulting way. By this point, it's very. Initially, she has visitors. She obviously lives with them. She gets to. She's protected. She goes out and meets local people. She has meetings. She has the local aristocrats come and she chats with them, and she goes to Buxton and she has lovely chats with Bess of Hardwicke. So she can sort of imagine to a degree that she is free, but it isn't at the end when she really gives up, I think, on ever being invited, on ever coming out, and she begins to see that Elizabeth's never going to meet her. They're never going to let her out, that she does involve herself in this plot, which is Babington is a very young, naive man, and I just don't think that even if the letter had got out and Elizabeth had not seen it, I just don't think the plot was ever going to work. It was never going to succeed, really. And whether or not Philip of Spain was ever going to invade when Mary was on the throne, it's because he doesn't want her to be the queen. He wants to get the ruling for himself, and so and that's the when after Mary is executed, it's almost that's when he decides to invade, and obviously it doesn't work, but that's when he decides to do it because he doesn't want to put Mary on the throne necessarily. He might say he wants the throne for himself. Yeah.
Wow, gosh, this is so fascinating. I could actually talk to you all day, but you've probably got things to do and I'm keeping you here. Kate, at the end of our little podcast episodes, we always play a little game of 10 to go with the guests, which is just basically 10, kind of random questions to get to know you a little bit better. Are you okay with us playing that game?
Let's do them.
All right. Fabulous. So what inspires you?
Oh, in life,
Just
kind of
in
thing.
life, yeah, in general, exactly.
Oh well, I've always loved reading, and I've always loved stories, and I've always loved history. I made a little time machine when I was a child and
Oh,
put my brother into it. It didn't, and I put my brother into it. I'd be about 7, he was about 5, and it was a big washing machine box that I covered in bits of cellophane and silver foil, and I put him in it and shook it around and took him to all kinds of places.
oh,
Um,
cute.
Egypt and Tudor England, and he loved it. He really loved it. And then, but he did. The problem is, I wouldn't let him out, and I kept saying, "You can't get out." He wants to see, and I tell him everything, and what I could see, like in Henry VIII's court, but he couldn't get out. So in the end, he rebelled and wouldn't get into the box anymore. And I tried it. I sat in and wobbled it, but it wouldn't work for me. So I made a time machine, and now he's my brother is 6'1" and a rugby player build, and he is getting in the box for anyone. But it was a fun game when I was, for the brief moment I was bigger than him. And so I made a time machine, and I love time machines, and I feel like I have a time machine every day now, because I look at these letters, I look at these diaries, I look at people's words, and so I get to whiz around in my time machine. So I love to read, and I love history, and I love living in my time machine, and there's nothing like reading the original letters of these people. I mean, it's unbelievable when you go to an archive and there is Mary's letter to Elizabeth, and you think, how who's touched this?
Yeah.
Of course, you really, really want to massage it, but so that your hand touches the same bit as hers, but of course you can't, so you don't. But it's amazing. So I'm just so inspired. Being a historian, it's just so amazing being surrounded by all these wonderful people, these wonderful historians. I've made so many friends and fabulous people like you, Natalie. You know, all these friends, all these history lovers, history fans, who do so much for history in the world, and that's really so incredible and so rewarding. And when I went into writing and history, I just wanted to write. I didn't think that it would bring me friendship and this wonderful world of friendship and collaboration. So that's really incredible.
Oh, that's fabulous, definitely. And I love the time machine. That's gorgeous.
Oh yeah, I know. I did. I really believe the hype, even though I knew it didn't work for my brother, and I'd just been wobbling it. I then got it myself because I believed it, but it didn't work.
All right. So number 2, when you were a child, what did you want to be? So have you always wanted to be a historian or a writer or something like that?
Yeah, I always did want to write. I always did write books. I wrote my first book when I was 7. I still have it, The Adventures of Maria, about an albatross knocked on her window and took her away, and she had all kinds of adventures in these strange islands. I've got to say that I do think, Natalie, it was my best book ever. Because the illustrations are actually better than anything I could manage now, and it's definitely the narrative arc and the character development. I think is particularly good. So I think it's my best.
That sounds gorgeous. You've got to share some pics of that.
I mean, at the end, I think I can feel myself. You know, sometimes with the debut, and sometimes the end rushes to it, and I can see myself doing that. But I do feel that the character arc was very clear. And so Adventures of Maria was my first wbook, and I've tried writing books ever since. I stopped for a while, I think, while I was in my late teenage and early university years, because then I started reading other books by other people, and some of them were so amazing. I mean, I was always reading, but then I started reading the classics. I just think, what's the point of me writing a novel if I can't write like Jane Austen? But then you start to you still have a contribution to do. So,
of course, that's right.
So I've always wanted to write. I mean, ever since I was very young, and I write and read. And I used to make, after the time machine, then I stopped. After the time machine stopped, I used to make my brother a historical comic called Chum, which had all kinds of competitions for him, but he never really entered. But even though he could win a chocolate bar and he was the entrance, he would be the only person to enter. So I've always wanted to write, and I've always wanted to write history, but of course I never thought that I necessarily would. So
how
it was amazing. But so every day I'm incredibly grateful that I get to sit down at my desk and my mind is full of all these people. Some of them made up people, historically made up people when I'm writing a novel, or some of them real people, and I get to have them both all having a sort of party in my head, and and I love it, and I'm obviously very great, and I'm very grateful that this is what I get to do every day.
Yeah, that's so wonderful. Now, you mentioned the time machine. I love time machines. That's why I keep talking about them. If you
real one,
yeah, I know we need a real one, exactly. But Kate, if you had a real one, let's just pretend you had a real one, and you could go back to one moment to witness one sort of event in Tudor history. What would you go back to?
Well, I go back to many moments. There are so many moments in Mary Queen of Scots' life that I could jump up and shout, "Don't do it! Don't do it!" Well, so I think I would. Now, the question is, which of Mary's husbands caused her more problems? Even obviously marrying to the future king of France. I mean, because as we were saying, she's away from Scotland. She's seen as a French princess. So where would I say don't do it? I think it's got to be Lord Darnley. I'd just say please don't marry him. Don't do it. And I think what I'd do is I'd dress up as a man and aristocratic man, and I'd say marry me instead, and that would be my answer. And then we'd kind of have to find some 16th century IVF and a donor or something and get her pregnant. So that's what I'm going to do in my time machine. I'm going to go back and I'd say don't marry Mary Queen of Scots. Don't marry. So I go back to say to Mary Queen of Scots, don't marry Darnley, marry me instead. Because basically there are many. That she could, if she hadn't married him, she would survive and instead. I mean, it would have been best, I think, had Elizabeth and Mary could marry each other. That would have been the best.
That's right. That may have solved all the issues, actually. Yeah.
I think that would solve all the problems. I mean, and then we could have developed some kind of 16th century IVF, and they could have had a baby. And I think that would be solved all the problems. It would have united the two countries. And I think that, I mean, obviously, I think there would have been some domestic arguments because they're both quite strong characters.
Exactly, yeah, that's true.
But I think it would have worked out if they could have married each other. But as they can't, I'm going to come in and I'm going to say to Mary, don't marry Darnley, marry me instead.
I love that. I love the way you think, Kate. That's wonderful. Now, what is something you love about where you live?
I live in London, and I love. Well, I'm currently in the Lake District where my parents live, just staying with my parents for a while, and
beautiful.
I love London because it's so much history there. Every inch of history under your foot, you think there's a body or something happening there, and I love that. I love it that there's every inch of there's something there, and that's what I love. You're walking over pavement, and whatever happened there years ago is so fascinating.
Yeah, London is an amazing place. Now, let's just imagine you were forced to flee the Earth, Kate. I don't know why, but you're forced to flee the Earth, and you can only take one book with you. What would it be? You're going into space.
Okay. Oh, wow. Well, I mean, obviously, I can't take a guide to living in space. Can I? That would be.
You can write that while you're out there, though.
I can't take a Lonely Planet guide to living on Mars. Or
no, sorry.
Only take one book. Well, I think I mean, obviously, in the desert island dish, you take the Bible. So
yes, you can have the Bible. Sorry, I should have said that. You can take the Bible and an additional book.
So, I mean, I like. I mean, not that I'm as religious as I used to be, but I do like to read the stories. So that will be lots of stories in there. So I can take a Bible and one other book. My goodness, Natalie, you do ask me tough questions.
Stumped you now.
I mean, I do like really big books.
Okay.
In general, I like nice big long novels that you can read huge amounts of. But I think I would have to take with me something really good, because obviously there are going to be other people out there that we could do book swap with.
That's
Hopefully
true.
So I could swap a few books around.
Yep, that's right.
I would take with me. I would take with
the
me.
suspense.
I'm thinking.
You can pass if you like.
I would take with me a big anthology of poetry, because sometimes I read a lot, but I don't always get enough time to read all the poetry that I'd like to read. I'm currently chairing the Women's Prize for Fictions. I've just finished reading 170 novels, so I read a lot of history books. I read a lot of historical sources, and I read a lot of novels. I read loads of novels. I get sent them, I review them, I read them. I like to keep up with what's going on in both the history world and the novel world, because I'm writing both. But I don't always get the time I want to read poetry. And I used to write poetry a lot when I was younger, but I don't do it so much anymore, actually. And so I would take a huge, big anthology of poetry, because I think that poetry you can reread, and I take, obviously there'll be lots of 16th century poetry in there, and lots of modern poetry. So I would spend my time on Mars reading poetry, rereading poetry, and I would write some of my own. Whether I just have to scratch it on a stone, I will be writing some poetry about my life on Mars.
On a rock in Mars. Yeah, you like Mars. I can see you're drawn to Mars.
Yeah, well, it's nice and red like my hair, but I mean, I think isn't there supposed to be a little bit of atmosphere on Mars? I don't really. I think there's meant to be. I think there's meant to be something that possibly we could live on Mars. But
exactly, they do say that, don't they?
I'd like to go to Venus most of all, but I think that there's nothing to live on, so I go to Mars and write poetry on Mars.
Oh, I love it. I love how creative you are. All right, so if you could swap place with a person, and they can be living or dead, doesn't matter, just for a day, who would you swap places with?
I would swap places with Mary Queen of Scots.
Yeah,
and I would be her. I would be her when she's about to ride into England to get Elizabeth to put her back on her throne, and I wouldn't do it. I'd ride back into Edinburgh, and I'd try and use it as my stronghold and get my throne back, even if it was just for a short amount of time.
Yeah.
So that's what I'd do. I'd swap with her, and I'd go back. And it would be a fight, I can imagine, because if I was in Mary's body, there would obviously be some of her head saying, "I want to go into
exactly,
into
I want to go to England." That's right.
It would be a fight. It would be a fight between me and the other parts of her head. It would be like those two Muppets, who always shout at the end of the show, "Oh, that was bad," or "That was good," or "That was bad," or "That was good." It would be like the two Muppets. But I reckon I'd win. I mean, I know she's a strong-willed person and much taller than me, because I am nowhere near 5'11". But I reckon in the battle I would win, and we'd turn the horse back. And we would not go into England.
Oh, I would love to see how that ends, by the way. I like that. So, you probably, I imagine that you do quite a bit of travel, because you do some research and travel for work. What do you miss most when you're away from home?
I do some travel. I did come on a lecture tour to Australia once.
Oh, did you?
I did. It was really fun. I went to Sydney, and I went to Armidale, all kinds of places.
Oh, wow.
And I went to Tasmania, which was amazing, and I had an amazing time. But it's so funny. It's so funny. I don't know whether you find this. It's so funny because obviously I'd been to Australia as a backpacker, but because in Britain, every film or TV show pretty much is about Australia. It's always really warm. So in things like Home and Away and Neighbours, it's always really warm. You think it's really warm, so I refused to bring a coat with me, and I said, I'm not taking a coat. Australia, it's too hot, because in Home and Away they're always wearing swimming costumes. But apparently someone tells me they're actually, the actresses and actors are always really chilly on that. It's actually cold. So it actually was quite not as warm as I expected in places like Tasmania and Armidale.
That's quite cold there. Yeah, exactly.
It wasn't boiling, but I had a splendid time on my Australian lecture tour. It was great. I met so many people, and I went to Dubbo, and I had all these. Gave my lectures. It was really great, and everyone knew so much and had all these interesting points. I'd love to come back. But yes, I like to travel. I do like to travel. I miss my family, of course. That's who I miss very much. But apart from them, I do also miss all my books and all the books I've got that I like to look at and consult. I really miss my books too.
Yeah, I love my books too. I miss them when I go away as well. And I think you need to come back to Australia, Kate. We've had a very hot summer, and you probably don't need your jacket right now if you come now.
My parents did, and they came to the tennis, and it was very warm. Yes, I know. I probably wouldn't need my coat, but yes, I didn't bring my coat, and I said I'm not. And I actually was rather cold in Tasmania.
Yeah.
So I didn't bring my coat.
Tassie's very cold, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I just didn't. It's so funny that, I mean, and obviously it makes sense when you look at where Australia is geographically. Why should it be boiling? Right. But because on TV, everyone's always in swimsuits in Home and Away.
That's right. It's summer bay. You have to wear your swimsuits.
Always summer. Yeah, it's not winter. It's never autumn. It's never a bit chilly bay. It's always so hot.
Oh, that's so funny. All right.
Everyone's like, oh, it's so hot there. You just think, not always.
Yeah, not always. That is true. Not always. So, lucky last question. What would you like to see more of in the world?
Oh, so many things. I would like to see more. I'd like to see more tolerance. The rise of racism, anti-Semitism, the rise of hatred. I mean, I know that it's always been there, but it seems as if we have a particular problem at the moment.
Yeah.
I'd like to see more collaboration. I think that it's obviously, when you look back at my life, there's been some amazing strides. I think about South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation, apartheid. I think about the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I mean, amazing, incredible things moving towards peace. And then we've had, sometimes we seem to be going back again in places. And I wish, it's such the sort of growth of hatred and racism and poverty and across the world. And I do think it is becoming very pressing how we use our world's resources, that future generations will look back on us and look back on what we have done to the planet, and they will condemn us for it. That climate change and discussion about global warming seems to come bottom of many priorities across the world. So I do think that we need. So I think this all sounds very serious, but I do think that we are at a crucial stage, I think, in so many of these questions. And if it was a lighter note, I think we all need more history and more historical stories and more stories. And stories and art are a great way of creating collaboration across nations. But I do think that when I think back over just little things like the amount of butterflies I saw when I was a child.
That is so true. That is so true. Yeah.
Things, even if I didn't read books and things, that I know that the country I live in terms of the natural world is not the same as the one I grew up in as a child, and even you can see it changing, and not in a good way. And I do think that future generations will look back on our time, and they'll say, and they'll listen to TV news programs and things, and just say, why is no one discussing climate change?
Yeah, what a brilliant way to end. But Kate, I have one more thing. I know I really want to adopt you. I think you're fabulous, Kate. I just want to. I think you're brilliant.
I'll bring my coat.
Bring your coat. You can stay with me. Don't worry. All is good. All is good.
Bring a light coat.
Bring a light coat.
I know not the woolly jumpers that I need for Scotland, but I'm going to bring a light coat. But yes, that would be lovely. I'd love to be. That would be fabulous. I'll just say the word.
Invitation. Open invitation. All right, Kate, this has been so wonderful. So I like to end the episode by asking my guests to share with us a Tudor takeaway. So something for our listeners to explore or to have a look at after the episode. Do you have a Tudor takeaway for us?
Well, I do.
Yes,
I know that all your listeners will have been, but I'm just thinking about Hampton Court.
Oh, I love it.
It's amazing, its grandeur. I know everyone's been listening, I'm sure, but I always like to go again, and I just think that it is an incredible building that really does. So many Tudor palaces have been lost, and it's hard really to imagine. It's quite hard really to imagine how Elizabeth I in her palaces, but in the same way. And Hampton Court, I think, really underlines this. Underlines. I meant the grandeur of the Tudors, the sort of confidence of the Tudors. Even though it was obviously a sort of a shaky claim to the throne, we might say comparatively. Here they are with this huge grandeur, and I just love it that. Obviously, I love it that Wolsey built this house and then said, "Well, you have it, Henry. Just have it, and please think well of me." And then Henry's like, "Okay, I've got the house, and sorry."
Yeah, I know. Oh gosh.
And I think that there's grandeur of it, that everything about it, the hugeness of the court, I think shows. I think it's the most amazing sort of aperçu into the Tudor world, and I do think it's a marvelous place, and there are a few really good MOOCs. I made a MOOC about Tudor feasting, royal feasting, and we walk around Hampton Court. We talked a lot about Hampton Court, and I know that Professor Susanna Lipscomb, she's made a very interesting MOOC about Tudor England that I am going to do. I'm signed up to do, so that's a really interesting, and I know they put Hampton Court on there as well. So I think there's obviously, there's lots of people listening who are going to be near Hampton Court, and lots of people listening who aren't going to be near Hampton Court.
That's right. Yeah.
And be able to go to another time. But I know we can't take Hampton Court away because it's so big. We can't actually put it in our pocket. But
what a pity! I know.
It is. I think I'm so grateful that we have it. When so many palaces have been lost, so many Tudor, we've lost so much Tudor architecture, so much of the built environment that the Tudors know has been lost. I think we're just so lucky to have it, and incredible preservation. You think that it was mooted to knock it down, that some of the later monarchs, William and Mary, thought, well, let's knock it all down and rebuild it.
Oh my goodness!
Lovely, Christopher Wren, very nice, but thank goodness that you didn't. So I think that's a Tudor takeaway.
Oh, thank you so much. I know that gives me nightmares thinking about the fact that it could have been all pulled down. Thank God they ran out of money, time.
Yeah,
what a nightmare that would have been.
We'll stick a wing on instead. Yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, exactly.
Because imagine, yes, it's just you can feel Henry VIII there, and I know Mary Queen of Scots never went there,
no.
but it's so much of what the attitude towards Scotland, the attitudes from both Henry and Elizabeth, you can, I think, feel them in Hampton Court, and it is so beautiful.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And on that note, Kate, thank you so much for your time. This has been absolutely brilliant. I've loved chatting with you.
Thank you for having me. It's been marvellous, and it's marvellous to speak, and all power to your wonderful, wonderful podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. And I hope you'll come back again one day and chat to me about your next book.
I would love to. I need to write a bit faster, though.
Okay.
Get it done.
All right. Well, lovely chatting with you.
Thank you so much.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you will also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and click on the all-important follow button so you'll never miss an episode. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.